Welcome to Unit 7, Lesson 2. Today we're going to be talking about blood vessels and blood flow through the body. And if you're watching this video, it's optional, so it probably means you've missed class or you want to pick something up. So to be able to, by the end of the day, you should be able to describe the structure and function of the various blood vessels and describe how cross-sectional area, blood pressure, and blood velocity changes through the various vessels. Explain why capillary beds are ideal for gas, nutrient, and waste exchange, and explain how materials are actually exchanged through the capillaries. You need to be able to explain blood pressure and the two key mechanisms the body uses to alter blood pressure. And finally, you need to be able to trace the route of blood through all the major veins and arteries of the body. So to begin with, we'll take a look at what a closed cardiovascular system is. And the simplest explanation is the human body has a closed cardiovascular system in that the blood is always contained within blood vessels. Except in the case of injury. This means that any exchange of materials between blood and tissues must occur across the blood vessel walls. And this is important because we basically have two types of blood vessels in terms of function. Those that specialize in transportation, of blood from one area to the other, and these are your arteries, mini arteries called arterioles, and your veins and mini veins called venules. And then we have blood vessels whose primary function is to exchange materials with tissues. Or external environment. And do you know what these are called? The thing that's missing out of arteries, arterioles, veins, and venules starts with a C. Came up with capillaries. Excellent. Sorry, it'd be even better if I spelt capillaries correctly. 1 P, 2 L's. There you go. So we're going to take a closer look at sort of the structure of the key blood vessels in the body. And what we have here is a longitudinal section of an artery, a capillary, and a vein. So that's if you cut it lengthwise. And for the capillary, they haven't even really cut it. They're looking at a whole capillary here. And right in here, I'll color it in red, is where the blood flows. And the rest is the tissue that actually makes up. So can't really see it, little bit flowing through here. This is the blood flow. And here, your blood flow. If you're watching really closely, you'll notice I just flipped around that vein to make it a little more realistic to how it works in our body. And in this case, blood flows up through those little gateways that are called valves, but they can't flow back down through them. They're one-way routes. Here we have the cross-section, and one thing about this cross-section is the capillary is not to scale. This capillary is much, much smaller than the veins and the arteries, but we'll give you, for arteries, if we're looking at the diameter, so cross here, arteries are typically approximately 2 centimeters to approximately 0.5 centimeters in diameter. Whereas capillaries are typically less than 0.1 centimeters in diameter. And veins are typically approximately 1.5 centimeters to 0.5 centimeters in diameter. And then something we should note is, I mentioned above, when arteries get much smaller than 0.5 centimeters, but they're still not a capillary, that equals arterioles. So, plus arterioles, which are smaller, and plus venules, which are in that in-between size from a vein and a capillary. If we look at the overall structure, it relates to the function of the different vessels. If we look up here, we see that an artery has a very thick wall around it. So its overall structure, it has 3 layers, and you don't need to know the details of all the layers, but the important one is it has a middle layer of connective, tissue, and muscle. To constrict and dilate the vessel. To regulate blood pressure. In contrast, if we look at the capillary, this is actually represents a single cell slightly overlapping with another single cell all the way around. So it is actually made up of one layer of single cells. And they are very numerous. But thin allowing for diffusion across the cell layer. And then we look at the vein, and it's kind of the happy medium between the two. Okay. It's back to having 3 layers, some connective tissue and muscle, but not as much. This makes it more elastic, so they can stretch out and actually hold most of your blood volume. So they're more elastic. And the other detail they have is they have valves to prevent backflow of blood. And if we look at the direction of blood flow through these arteries, or vessels, one thing that's important, there's often a misconception that arteries carry a certain type of blood, oxygenated or deoxygenated, and vice versa, but that's not quite accurate. What makes an artery is the direction of blood flow, and arteries carry blood away, artery for away, from heart, which means veins carry blood. If you said towards the heart, you are correct. And capillaries actually connect the blood flowing from artery to vein. So that's the key direction of blood flow through the blood vessels. Now, as suggested above, blood vessel structure influences the function of blood vessels, and we can take another look at a relationship between structure and function, and in particular, how blood actually flows through a blood vessel. So we're going to make a graph here, and we're going to trace the flow of blood through the vessels and look at several features of the vessels on the graph. So the graph's actually going to be multi-dimensional. So we're going to go across, and we're going to consider, we're going to start with a section that refers to arteries. So this is going to be the artery section. And then we're going to go to a section that refers to the capillaries. And then we're going to look at a section of the graph that is considering what's going on in the veins. And now I've drawn it the stereotypical red for oxygenated blood, blue for deoxygenated blood, and purple for a mix between the two in the capillaries. But we are going to come up with examples where arteries are not always carrying oxygenated blood and veins are not always carrying deoxygenated blood. So when we're looking at this, the first thing our graph is going to consider is the cross-sectional area of these vessels. And what cross-sectional area means is how much tube space, if we add it all up, is there for the blood to flow through. And even though the arteries have a very large diameter, they actually don't have that much cross-sectional area because there just aren't that many arteries. Then you add up all the capillaries and you find you have a lot of cross-sectional area. And then we come down to the veins, which have the least cross-sectional area. So this line is going to be our cross-sectional area. And basically what you're looking at is how wide, if you have one big wide stream, what's the cross-sectional area? Versus lots of tiny little streams, in the end, you add them all up, you've got a very large cross-sectional area. And then down to the veins, because veins are a little bit smaller, but comparable in numbers to arteries, you drop just a little bit below with the cross-sectional area. But cross-sectional area is actually going to influence the speed at which blood flows through the vessels. Okay. So we're going to talk about, we'll go green for go, blood velocity. And when we start out close to the heart, going through this relatively low cross-sectional area, the blood velocity is moving pretty fast. But as we get further and further away from the heart and into the greater cross-sectional area, the velocity of the blood slows down. And then as the area decreases again, the blood velocity starts to pick up. Doesn't quite reach all the way, but it picks up. And the best analogy for understanding this really is thinking about creeks and water flow through creeks and streams. And when you have a narrow channel, not a lot of cross-sectional area for the water to go through, maybe it's rushing down a channel, it will flow very fast, like in the artery. But when you spread it out into lots of little channels with lots of cross-sectional area, like little creeks in a delta, the water will actually slow down its speed. When the blood hits the capillaries, has this greater cross-sectional area, even though they're little channels, there's way more of them, so it has lots of routes to take, and it will actually slow down. Then as it goes back into the veins and the cross-sectional area decreases again, it starts to pick up speed again. All of this is going to be very relevant to how materials can exchange across the blood vessels. And then our last thing we're going to talk about, we'll go with orange, is our blood pressure. So in our arteries, right near our heart, our blood pressure is very high. And the little up and downs are just indicating relative to your heart beating. And as you start to drop further and further away from the heart, your blood pressure drops. And the veins, which is farthest away from the actual original pump of the heart, it drops the lowest. Now, all of this is important to how materials are exchanged through the blood vessel. And in particular, I want you to think about blood velocity. If you are going through the drive-in at McDonald's and you have to go through the pickup window and you try and drive through it at 80 kilometers an hour, there's a chance that you're actually going to successfully pick up or exchange your food for money, vice versa. Not very good, but if you slow down, you have better chance of exchanging your materials. And it's the same in your capillaries. When the blood velocity slows down, because the cross-sectional area increases, you have a good opportunity for doing exchange. As well, as the blood pressure alters from one side of the capillary to the other, we will alter the direction that we actually do our exchange in, and we'll show that in the next diagram. Okay, but the key thing here, we can summarize this graph in a table. So we can go artery, capillary, vein, and we can look at, first of all, cross-section area. We don't need absolute numbers, we just need what is the relative amount. So if we look at that graph, we have what has the least cross-sectional area. Just barely, but the veins are the least, the arteries are low, and the capillaries are high. I wouldn't call the arteries medium because they're actually fairly close to the veins. They're just slightly higher. And we can look at blood velocity. If we look at the artery, it's the highest. We look at the capillary, it is low. We look at the vein, it is medium. And then when we look at blood pressure, this simply drops the further it gets from the heart. So the arteries are the closest to the heart, it's taking the blood away from the heart, so when the heart artery beats, or the heart beats, it pumps it into the artery, out to the body, and it is the highest. It hits the capillaries, it's dropping, it's medium. And by the time it's coming all the way back up to the heart through the vein, it's at the lowest. And this combination makes the arteries and veins and capillaries able to do various things. So, in particular, we were talking about how capillaries are designed for gas exchange or exchange of all sorts of materials. So, capillaries are ideal for exchanging gas, nutrients, and waste with tissues due to several things. One, being one cell layer thick, because this makes it easy for things to diffuse across. Two, because it has relatively slow blood flow, so things actually have time to do the exchange. And finally, three, because the blood pressure is sufficiently high at arterial end to force contents out of the capillary. Okay, so now let's take a closer look at how those contents are actually forced in or out of the capillary. We're going to start over at this end, and this will be the end of the artery slash arterioles. So this is your blood bringing in the contents you want. And this end will be the end of the venule slash vein, taking away the waste that you no longer want. And floating through the middle, we have our little red blood cells. And two things are important for exchange to occur. We need blood pressure, which is also sometimes called the hydrostatic pressure. Hydro just referring to liquid pressure. And we need osmotic pressure. Which is really the draw of water towards higher solute concentrations, which can be salt, but it can be proteins and other things. And depending on the combination of these two, it'll dictate which ways things flow in and out of the cell or out of the vessel. So here, as the blood flows in, flowing in this direction, there is an outward force caused by the blood pressure. And we can actually measure that. And we measure pressure as millimeters of mercury. We call it the hydrostatic pressure. And at the beginning of most capillaries, that outward force is approximately 35 millimeters of mercury. But there's an inward force as well, because you have a high concentration of salt here that's going to draw the water from the tissues inwards. This is your osmotic pressure. And it's usually about 24 millimeters of mercury. And if you consider the two forces, outwards and inwards, and we get is net outward force of 11 milligrams of mercury. So at the arterial end, things are forced out of the blood vessel, including water, salts, nutrients. But what happens is these things exit, your concentration changes, and your osmotic pressure will, while it stays up, so what happens is this forces water out of the blood vessel. And as water leaves, your blood volume decreases, and as your blood volume decreases, your blood pressure decreases. So as we get towards the venule or vein end, the hydrostatic pressure actually changes. So we get down to that end, the outward force drops. The hydrostatic drops to about 16 millimeters of mercury. Meanwhile, the osmotic pressure inwards remains relatively the same, at 24 millimeters of mercury. And if you add these two together, you get a net inward force of approximately 8 millimeters of mercury. So water starts returning into the blood vessel, and along with it in comes some of the waste from the tissue. And then the blood continues to flow onward and out into the vein. So things are going to diffuse according to their respective concentration gradients, but water will move according to the osmotic pressure combined with the hydrostatic pressure. So capillaries, though, don't exist by themselves. They actually exist in what we call capillary beds, which is a sort of a mass of little capillaries all at once. What will happen is you'll have your major arteriole, which will be connected further back to a larger artery, and then it goes into what's called a meta-arteriole, and it can travel through the capillary bed, do its exchange, and go back out through a venule. And the important thing here that we want to note are these things called precapillary sphincters. They can close off a capillary bed. Now this is important because if you think about when we talked about the sympathetic response, which decreases digestion, and it also decreases blood flow to digestive tract. And the way it does this is it closes off these little sphincters so that the blood can't actually go into the capillary network, but rather must go straight on through to the other side via what's called a thoroughfare channel. So it just pops right on through, doesn't really do any exchange, and moves on to muscles or wherever it's needed. But generally, it's actually flowing through the capillary bed, and when it's flowing through the capillary bed, such as over here, you're going to start with your blood into the capillary, should be high in O2, low in CO2, high in nutrients, and low in waste. And as it performs exchange across the capillary bed and comes out this way, the blood exiting bed should now be low in O2, higher in CO2, low in nutrients, and high in waste. Okay. That's at least for what we call a capillary bed that is a systemic capillary bed. Meaning general body tissues. The exception being, it's a little bit different when we look at what's going on in the lungs. Okay? But for now, we're going to focus on our systemic capillary beds. So one thing that fits in with this part and blood flow through our blood vessels is blood pressure. And blood pressure is simply a measure of the force that blood exerts on the wall of a blood vessel as it flows through. And it's a good indicator of the health of your blood vessels. And for the most part, it's typically measured in the brachial artery, which is the artery in the arm. You have probably all seen where a blood pressure cuff goes. It's right under that cuff. And when we measure it, we actually take two measures. What's called your systolic number, which is the highest pressure in your brachial artery due to ventricles contracting. It's called systolic because another word for contracting is systole. Over what we call your diastolic, which is your lowest pressure that should occur in your blood vessel due to ventricle relaxing. And your ventricles refer to parts of your heart, and we'll talk about that next day. And if you are healthy, your blood pressure should be approximately 120 over 80 millimeters of mercury systole or systolic over distole or diastolic. Diastole, I should have said. That should not look like a T. And if your blood pressure is too low, it could be an indicator of something wrong with your health or just of severe dehydration. And if your blood pressure is too high, it could be an indicator that your blood vessels are becoming blocked and that something else is wrong with your system. Now, there are many mechanisms that your body uses to regulate blood pressure, some on quite a fine scale, but there's two main approaches. One is the quick and dirty approach if they need to suddenly change your blood pressure, and one's a little more of a long-term blood pressure adjustment. So for short-term, in stress situations, body can adjust to increase blood pressure via what's called vasoconstriction. In particular, in your arteries with that extra muscle layer, arteries constrict to increase blood pressure. Okay. Can lower via, again with the arteries, what's the opposite of constrict? Your pupils do these to let more light in. You said dilate, vasodilation. You are correct. Okay. That's sort of a short-term, immediate response to changes or stresses in your situation. In a more day-to-day basis, the body uses the kidneys to regulate amount of water in the blood. And if you increase H2O in blood, what happens to the volume of your blood? I said increase volume, you're correct. And if you have more volume of blood, your blood vessels don't suddenly get bigger, so there's more room. So it actually increases the blood pressure. In contrast, if you decrease the H2O in your blood, you decrease the volume, and therefore you decrease the blood pressure. And your body is very good at doing this. It uses a variety of hormones to regulate, and we're going to learn about those details to be learned in the excretory unit, where we talk about kidney function. Don't worry, it's coming up next. Okay, so one last thing, and that's what is the route that the blood takes through the body. This is kind of fun. It's just learning the pathway of blood in your body. So let's identify the key features here. This here is meant to refer to your lungs. I'm going to write these parts in small. This is to refer to your head. Very glorified looking head. This obscure looking structure is actually your heart. We'll take a closer look at that next day. This is your small intestine. This is your, hopefully you get it, yes, liver. Do you get what these little guys are? Your kidneys. And this is your pelvic area. And then we're going to draw in vessels that come off here, down to there, and return back. And we're really only going to show you sort of the vessels leaving the heart, returning back to the heart, and we're going to make it look like they only exist on one side of the body, but they exist on both sides. So if we draw something down the middle of the body, it may only be in the middle of the body, but if we draw something heading off to your head or heading off to your arms, you also have a parallel one that comes back on both the right and left side. So the first important thing is to understand what blood is going where, what type of blood. So we're going to start where we usually start referring to the heart. We're going to start right here in the heart. Okay, so blood is at this point deoxygenated. So the blood's going to come into the heart and leave. It's going to go to the lung. When it goes to the lung, it's going to pick up oxygen. It's going to return from the lung down to the heart, down into the ventricle, back up through the atrium, and we'll learn these terms next day, and then it's going to head on off to the body. Some to the lower body, some to the head, some to the arms. We'll add in those vessels in a minute. It's going to go to the small intestine. It's going to head down to your kidneys. It's going to head down to your pelvic region. It's going to head down to your legs. Eventually, it's actually going to start losing its oxygen as it gives it off to tissues. It's going to go through your small intestine to your liver, and we discussed how the other day, or other unit, that blood goes directly from the small intestine to the liver. It's going to go through your kidneys. It's going to go through your pelvic area, maybe down to your legs, and eventually it's going to come back deoxygenated. Up through your legs, up through your pelvis, back through your kidneys, up, picking up through your liver, back to your heart. As well, remember we sent it up to our head, it's got to come back down from our head to our heart. Okay. And all these vessels have really important names, and we're going to try and learn as many of them as possible. So let's start with the main vessel leaving our heart. And you're going to have to watch this carefully. In fact, I advise that you watch and follow along as I'm drawing with the pen, and then stop the video, rewind it, and write it down. So just watch for the first time through. Okay? So, the main vessel coming out of the heart, right here. We're going to go with black, sorry. Main vessel out of the heart. It's that big vessel, it's an artery, starts with an A. It's the size of a garden hose, is your aorta. Okay, so it's carrying high O2 blood from heart. Okay. The aorta then splits to a vessel that heads up to the head. It's called the carotid. So your carotid artery. Again, this is high O2. Off of that, we're going to add in a little vessel that's not in the simplified diagram. You also have a branch off of there that goes to your arm. That branch to your arm runs just under your collarbone. Okay, so what's the fancy word for collarbone? Starts with a C. You might know it. CL. If you got clavicle, you're right. And right below, so feel where your collarbone is, right below that is a major blood vessel. It's called because it's below. What prefix do we use for below? Like below the ground and below the water. If you said that's your subclavian for clavicle, subclavian artery, you'd be correct. So it's carrying high O2 blood to the arm. Okay. So your aorta actually wraps, this drawing doesn't show it well, but it wraps up and around the heart and then goes down towards the body. So this here is still considered part of your aorta. And where it branches off to head to your digestive system, you might have heard this word before referring to the digestive area. It's called your mesenteric artery. As it continues down towards your kidneys, do you know the fancy name for kidney failure? Starts with an R. R-E. If you came up with renal, that's the fancy word referring to the kidneys, and because this artery is going to the kidneys, it's called the renal artery. As it proceeds down to your pelvic area, it's called your iliac artery. And it proceeds down your leg near your femur. It is called your femoral artery. Okay, so all of these arteries are carrying high O2. Now remember, not all arteries carry high O2, but these ones are. High O2, high O2. Of course, the further you get from your heart, your O2 levels start to drop. And coming back, now we're showing it in the other leg, but you definitely have one in both legs to come back. But coming back, we have what's called the femoral vein. Then when we come back up above and we're in the pelvic area, it's called the iliac vein. And following this, what do we think coming out of the kidneys is called? You got the renal vein, you are correct. And each kidney has its own renal artery and renal vein feeding it. Now, this little region here that links small intestine into the liver is called the hepatic portal vein. Portal meaning to go into. So the hepatic portal vein carries the blood from the small intestine into the liver, whereas coming out of the liver, we simply have the hepatic vein. And remember, we learned in our digestion unit that the fancy word for liver is hepatic. Then we have the ultimate vein, collecting all the blood from the lower body and bringing it into the heart. And because it comes from below, what is the word we use when we think someone is less than us or below us? Starts with an I. And it's the opposite when you think you are better than someone or above someone. If you said inferior, you're correct. This is called the inferior vena cava. And then, coming down from the head, we have, what's the major vein in your neck that if you slice it, you die almost immediately? In lots of movies, they'll talk about he sliced this vein. Or you go for this if you're an athlete and you want to finish your opponent. You said the jugular vein? And of course, that's a figure of speech in athletics. You are correct. And coming back from the arm, this one keeps its name. It's again the subclavian vein. And then where they all pull together, bringing back all the blood from the upper body to the heart. It's coming from above, it thinks it's better. It's called the superior vena cava. Okay, so now we only have two things left to identify. Now here, these are all bringing back to the heart, and they are all carrying low O2 blood. All the way down. And here's where things get a little bit different and complicated. What direction do veins carry blood? Towards or away from the heart? If you said towards, you're correct. So once the blood, deoxygenated blood, enters the heart, it has to be pumped away to the lungs to pick up more blood. So what are we going to call this one here that pumps away to the lung? Okay. It's away, so it's an artery. It's a fancy word for lung. What do you do to someone who's not breathing properly? You give them what? You said CPR, you're correct. Now the question is, what does the P stand for? If you said pulmonary, you are correct. So leaving the heart is the pulmonary, and it's going away, artery. But it's carrying low O2 blood. So this is one of a couple exceptions I'll show you. The other one involving a developing fetus, where an artery carries low O2 blood. And once it goes through the lungs and picks up its oxygen and it's coming back to the heart, it's called the pulmonary vein, and it's now carrying high O2 blood. Okay, those are the key blood vessels of your body. Obviously there's many more, but that gives you the overview of the path of blood through the body. And I honestly should be able to start anywhere here and say, okay, starting from the liver, trace the flow of blood through the body, through the heart, through the lungs, back to the liver. Or I could pick, hey, starting at the pelvic area or down in the leg. And you should be able to follow this route all the way around. So hopefully you actually sat and watched that. Now is a good time to rewind the video, go back and actually do the notes for it. Or if you did the notes while you were watching the first time, now rewind and watch it all the way straight through. If you have any questions about that, please come see me. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in class.